She walked down the aisle, promising forever. By sunrise, she was leafless in her honeymoon suite. At 4 a.m., her husband, Omari Kiris, called 911, sobbing that his wife was dying. But when paramedics arrived, she was already gone. Her body open, her unborn child never given a chance to live. Hours before, they were in bed, laughing, loving. Then she whispered a name that wasn't his. Was this a crime of passion, or a man punishing the woman who humiliated him? Welcome to True. Zafina Jarell was the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. Bold, charismatic, and fiercely independent, she had built a name for herself in the world of event planning. She thrived in the chaos of last-minute changes, high-pressure deadlines, and the fast-paced energy of her career. People admired her confidence, her ability to command attention, and the way she carried herself with an air of effortless charm. But those closest to her knew she held on to the past more than she cared to admit. Omari Kiris had always been different. A quiet force in the world of real estate, he was the type of man who let his work speak for itself. Reserved, calculated, and deeply ambitious, he had built a successful career, one deal at a time. While he wasn't loud or flashy, his presence was undeniable. He was the kind of man who valued stability, loyalty, and, above all, love. And he loved Zafina more than she would ever understand. Their relationship had been a whirlwind, passionate yet complicated. Omari had fallen for her instantly, drawn to her energy, her drive, and the way she made life feel exciting. But for all the love he poured into their relationship, there was always something lingering between them. Zafina had a habit of bringing up her past, and not in passing. She talked about Malachi's sire, the man she had once loved, the way some people spoke about unfinished business. She would mention him during casual conversations, compare Omari's reactions to Malachi's, and downplay Omari's discomfort when he voiced his feelings. She insisted he was overreacting, brushing off his growing frustrations with a dismissive wave. "You're too insecure," she would tell him with a smirk. "Just because I talk about my ex doesn't mean I still want him. You need to stop making it a big deal." But it was a big deal. Omari wasn't blind to the way her voice softened when she spoke about Malachi. He wasn't deaf to the way she laughed when she recalled certain memories. And he wasn't imagining the way she seemed to compare him to a ghost he could never compete with. Friends noticed the tension between them, but they wrote it off as normal pre-wedding stress. After all, every couple had their struggles. But for Omari, it was more than stress. It was the sinking realization that no matter what he did, no matter how much he loved her, a part of Zafina's heart had never truly belonged to him. Still, he held on. Because he loved her, because he wanted to believe that love was enough. The wedding was everything Zafina had wanted, extravagant, meticulously planned, and filled with the kind of glamour she thrived in. Dressed in a custom-designed gown, she looked radiant, glowing under the soft lights of the reception hall. Omari stood by her side, smiling, saying all the right words, making all the right moves. But beneath the surface, he was fighting a battle within himself. He had seen the looks exchanged between her bridesmaids when she mentioned Malachi in passing. He had heard the whispers when she joked about how Omari was so different from her ex. Even on their wedding day, the comparisons hadn't stopped. But he ignored it. Because love, he told himself, meant patience. Love meant understanding. Love meant putting aside his insecurities and focusing on the life they were about to build together. So he kissed his bride. He held her hand. he convinced himself that this was the beginning of something new, something real. He went through with the wedding because he loved her so much. Hours later, that love would turn to rage, and their honeymoon suite would become the scene of a crime so brutal that even seasoned detectives would struggle to make sense of it. The call came in at exactly 4:07 a.m. The voice on the other end was frantic, shaking, barely coherent. She's dying! Please, you have to come! She's bleeding everywhere!" The 911 operator's voice remained calm, controlled, guiding him through the standard set of questions. "Sir, I need you to slow down. What happened? Who is bleeding?" "My wife, Zafina! She's... Oh God, I don't know what happened. She's not breathing. Please, hurry!" "Is she responsive? Can you tell me where she's bleeding from?" Her stomach, there's so much blood. Oh my God, I don't know what to do." There was a brief pause, the sound of heavy breathing, the rustling of fabric. The operator listened closely, picking up on every detail. His short, gasping breaths, the choked-back sobs, the rising panic in his voice. But there was something else. Something off. "Sir, I need you to stay on the line. Help is on the way. Can you tell me what happened before she started bleeding?" "I don't know. I swear I don't know. Please, just get here fast." The call abruptly ended. Within minutes, the wail of sirens cut through the quiet streets, an ambulance and 2 unmarked detective cars racing toward the upscale honeymoon suite. By the time they arrived, the room was already deathly still. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. The suite, which hours their wedding earlier had been a picture-perfect scene of luxury. White linen sheets, champagne on ice, a city skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, was now a chaotic mess of shattered glass and deep crimson stains. Zafina Jurel lay motionless in the center of the room, her body sprawled awkwardly across the hotel's plush carpet. Her nightgown was soaked in blood, her stomach torn open by jagged wounds. A deep gash stretched from just below her ribs to her navel, a wound so vicious it had left nothing to the imagination. There was no pulse, no movement, no sign of life. She had bled out long before anyone arrived. Omari Kirisi stood a few feet away, his shirt stained with his wife's blood. His hands shook violently, his face contorted with shock, his body swaying slightly as if the weight of what had happened was only now beginning to settle in. His eyes, wild and unfocused, darted between the paramedics and the detectives who stepped into the room. What happened here? The lead detective, Kimani Rochelle, didn't waste a second. He scanned the room, taking in every detail. The blood splatter on the walls, the overturned furniture, the broken champagne bottle glistening under the dim hotel lighting. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a simple case of a honeymoon gone wrong. This was a crime scene. Omari's breathing was erratic. His hands kept reaching for his head, his fingers digging into his scalp as he mumbled to himself. The smell of alcohol clung to him, his speech slightly slurred, but his eyes were sharp, shifting nervously between the paramedics, desperately trying to revive a woman who was long past saving. "Sir, we need to know what happened, now. I don't know. We were just... And then she just... Oh my God, I don't know." Detective Rochelle's gaze didn't waver. He had seen this before. The panic, the hysteria, the tears. He had seen guilty men try to fold into themselves, to make themselves small in the face of what they had done. And he had seen innocent men crumble under the weight of real, uncontrollable grief. Which one was Omari? "Why did you wait to call 911? Omari's head snapped up. "What? Your wife is dead, Mr. Kyrese, and from what I can see, She's been dead for a while, but your call came in at 4:07 a.m. That means there's a gap." Rochelle motioned toward the paramedics, who were now covering Zafina's body with a sheet. "A long one. What happened in that time?" Omari swallowed hard, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. "Sir, were you alone in this room?" Yes. It was just us." "You said she was bleeding everywhere. What caused the bleeding?" Omari's fingers twitched at his sides. I don't know. We were drinking. I don't remember. I don't—" His voice cracked, and he let out a shaky breath. "I swear, I don't know." Detective Rochelle nodded, turning to his partner, Adisa Morrow, who had been silently observing from the corner of the room. "Bag up every piece of glass. I want prints lifted. Get a full sweep of this room, everything, and I want the tox reports on her ASAP." He turned back to Omari. "We're going to need you to come with us." Omari's body stiffened. I need to stay. I need to—" "Your wife is gone, Mr. Kyrese. There's nothing more you can do for her now." Omari's breath hitched in his throat, his shoulders slumping. He let out a low, broken sob, his hands covering his face. Detective Rochelle wasn't moved. This wasn't grief. This was something else entirely. And the investigation was just getting started. The investigation moved swiftly. With Zafina Jarell's body now in the hands of the medical examiner and Omari Kyrese in custody, detectives began piecing together the truth of what had happened inside that honeymoon suite. The evidence would speak for itself, and it didn't take long before the gaps in Omari's story became impossible to ignore. The medical examiner's report was the first major breakthrough. Zafina had been dead for approximately 2 hours before Omari placed that frantic 911 call. That meant, while he was sobbing to dispatchers, begging for help, she had already taken her last breath hours earlier. The delay in calling for emergency services immediately raised red flags. Why wait? Her cause of death was clear: multiple stab wounds to the abdomen. The instrument of death? Jagged glass, likely from the shattered champagne bottle found at the crime scene. The wounds were erratic, deep, and frenzied. Classic signs of an uncontrolled attack, fueled by emotion rather than premeditation. But it wasn't just the fatal wounds that told the story. Zafina had defensive wounds across her arms and hands, deep lacerations from where she had fought to protect herself. She hadn't gone quietly. She had struggled, clawed, and fought for her life. And yet Omari had claimed he didn't know what happened. Detectives carefully reconstructed the events inside the honeymoon suite. The room itself was a portrait of chaos: overturned furniture, bloodstains stretching from the bed to the floor, and a broken champagne bottle with pieces scattered in every direction. But there was one crucial detail that forensic analysts focused on: the blood spatter pattern. The pattern on the walls and floor suggested an up-close, frenzied attack. The force used to drive the jagged glass into Zafina's body had sent blood arcing outward, landing on the furniture, the walls, and even on Omari's own clothes. Forensics determined the angle and distribution of the spatter, proving that Omari had been standing directly over her at the time of the attack. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a third party. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't an outside attack. This was domestic, and it was personal. Omari had insisted that he had no recollection of what happened, that the alcohol clouded his memory, that it was all a blur. But the toxicology report told a different story. Yes, there was alcohol in his system, but not enough to black out, not enough to erase memory. He had been drinking, but he had been aware, fully conscious. Whatever happened in that room, Omari knew exactly what he had done. For 7 hours, Omari sat in an interrogation room, faced with 2 detectives who had seen this scenario play out too many times before. He started with denial. "I don't remember. I blacked out. We were drinking. I don't know how she got hurt." But the detectives weren't buying it. The interrogation room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Omari Keresi sat in the metal chair, his hands clasped together, his eyes vacant. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Across from him sat Detective Kimani Rochelle and Detective Adisa Morrow, two seasoned investigators who had seen it all before. They knew the dance, the game suspects played to buy time, to weave lies into something that sounded believable. But they also knew the signs of a man unraveling. Omari had been brought in just after the forensic team finished processing the honeymoon suite. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't demanded his rights. He had barely spoken since they escorted him from the hotel. Now he sat there, exhausted, staring at the table, waiting for it all to go away. But it wasn't going away. Detective Rochelle leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "Omari, let's start with something simple. Walk us through what happened last night." Omari licked his lips, his throat dry. His voice was barely above a whisper. We were happy. We had an amazing wedding. We were celebrating, laughing, drinking, talking about the future. And then we went to bed. And? Omari's eyes darted toward the one-way mirror. "I don't remember." Detective Morrow didn't flinch. "You don't remember?" We had been drinking. I blacked out. I woke up, and she was just there, bleeding. I don't know what happened. Detective Rochelle exchanged a glance with Morrow. They had heard this before. Too many times. "You blacked out," Rochelle repeated. "Omari, we know that's not true. The toxicology report says you had alcohol in your system, but not enough to make you forget an entire murder. So I'll ask again. What happened?" Omari's hands twitched. His fingers interlocked, gripping each other tightly as if trying to ground himself. He took a deep breath, but his voice wavered. "We were happy." Morrow leaned forward, his voice steady. "Omari, Zafina had been dead for at least 2 hours before you called 911. 2 hours. What were you doing in that time?" Omari's breathing hitched. He shifted in his seat, rubbing his temple, shaking his head slightly as if trying to block out the question. "I don't know, man. I panicked. I woke up and she was covered in blood. I didn't know what to do." "You didn't think to call for help?" I was in shock. For 2 hours." Silence. Rochelle folded his hands in front of him, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me, Omari, is that really the story you want to go with?" Omari's jaw tightened. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. He could feel the walls closing in. The pressure increases, breaking the timeline. Morrow pulled out a file and placed it on the table. Slowly he flipped it open, revealing crime scene photos. The shattered glass bottle, the blood spatter, Zafina's lifeless body. "This isn't an accident," Morrow said, his voice steady. "This isn't a mystery. You were there. You did this. The only thing we don't know is why." Omari clenched his fists. His knuckles turned white. "I loved her," he whispered. "Then tell us the truth," Rochelle pressed. Omari exhaled, his shoulders sagging. The room was suffocating. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. His mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to make it all disappear. But there was no escape. And then, just like that, he broke. The breaking point. A night that turned to blood. His voice cracked as he finally spoke. "We were happy. We had fun. We talked about our future, about our honeymoon, about everything we wanted. We laughed. She told me how much she loved me. And then we started kissing. She told me how she wanted it. She was telling me what to do, how to touch her. She was whispering. His breath hitched. His fingers gripped the edges of the table as if holding himself together. Then she screamed his name. The detectives stayed silent. They let the weight of that statement settle. She screamed Malakai's name. Omari's voice wavered, his eyes glassy with a distant look, as if reliving the moment. I froze. For a second, I thought I misheard her, but then she said it again, louder, and I knew. I knew she wasn't with me. She wasn't thinking about me. She wasn't in love with me. She was picturing him, Malakai, the man she swore she had moved on from, the man she kept bringing up, the man she compared me to. Tears welled in his eyes, but there was no sadness in them, only rage. I wasn't enough for her. I was never enough. She didn't marry me because she loved me. She married me because she couldn't have him. I was just a placeholder, a body in a bed she didn't want me in. His breaths turned ragged. I got up. I started breaking things, throwing things. I was yelling. I told her she was disrespectful, that she humiliated me, that she lied to me. And you know what she did? Silence. Omari laughed, a dry, bitter sound. She laughed. She told me I was overreacting, that it wasn't a big deal, that I needed to stop being so insecure. His expression darkened. That's when I grabbed the bottle. He exhaled sharply, his hands shaking. She was still laughing, telling me to grow up, that I was acting like a child, that it didn't mean anything, that she didn't do anything wrong, that I was just being weak. He inhaled deeply, his body trembling. I saw red. I lost it. I smashed the bottle, and before I knew it, it was in my hand, and she was on the floor. She was screaming, crying, trying to fight me off. But I just kept going. I don't even remember how many times His voice trailed off. When it was over, she was just lying there, and I realized I had killed my wife. Omari's head dropped into his hands. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I sat there. I watched her, watched the blood spread across the floor. I just kept thinking about what she said, about Malakai, about how I wasn't enough. And then I realized no one was coming. No one was going to save her. So I staged the call. I made it seem like I just found her like that. The confession was complete. Rochelle and Morrow sat back. The case was closed. Omari had walked into that interrogation room a free man. He would never walk out of it the same way again. The trial of Omari Kirisi wasn't just a trial about a husband murdering his wife. It was a case that sparked reactions about jealousy-fueled violence, toxic masculinity, and the fine line between crime of passion and cold-blooded murder. The courtroom was packed with community. Friends and family filled every available seat, eager to capture every moment. The prosecution and the defense knew that the stakes were high, not just for Omari, but for the message this case would send. Would the jury see this as a crime of temporary insanity, an emotional outburst that spiraled out of control? Or would they see Omari as a man who knew exactly what he was doing when he reached for that broken bottle? The battle for justice had begun. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Jamal Everston, wasted no time laying out their argument. This was not just a crime of passion, Everston told the jury in his opening statement. This was a murder fueled by control, rage, and a deep-rooted sense of entitlement. The prosecution's case hinged on three critical points. The brutality of the attack. Zafina Jarrell didn't die from a single wound. She suffered over a dozen stab wounds to her abdomen, each one driven with force. The medical examiner testified that some of the wounds were inflicted after she was already incapacitated, meaning Omari didn't just snap, he kept going. The delay in calling 911. The autopsy confirmed that Zafina had been dead for 2 hours before Omari made that frantic call. The prosecutor argued that this delay wasn't shock, it was intent. Omari wanted her to die. If this was truly an accident, why didn't he immediately call for help? The words he used before the murder. The prosecution played a chilling clip from Omari's interrogation tape, where he admitted Zafina had laughed at him before he killed her. She told me I was overreacting, that I was weak, that it wasn't a big deal. Everston turned to the jury and asked, "And what did he do?" He made sure she never laughed again. The prosecution painted Omari as a man consumed by his own insecurity, a man who didn't just lose control, but a man who made a decision to kill. Omari's defense team, led by attorney Marcus Hollins, took a different approach. "My client is not a monster," Hollins argued. "He is a man who loved his wife so much that in one tragic moment, that love turned into something he didn't recognize." The defense knew they couldn't deny that Omari had killed Zafina. Instead, they focused on why. Temporary insanity due to emotional distress. Hollins brought in a forensic psychiatrist who testified that hearing a partner call out another person's name during intimacy is one of the most psychologically distressing experiences a person can endure. He argued that in that split second, Omari wasn't thinking rationally. He was reacting to extreme emotional pain. Hollins told the jury, "Imagine the person you love, the person you just married, the person you vowed to spend your life with, telling you, in the most intimate moment, that she is thinking of another man. Wouldn't that break you?" Alcohol as a mitigating factor. The defense argued that Omari's blood alcohol level, while not high enough to cause blackouts, was enough to impair his judgment. They claimed the combination of alcohol and emotional distress turned a heated argument into a fatal altercation. A crime of passion, not premeditation. Hollins made it clear that Omari did not plan to kill Zafina. If this was premeditated, why wasn't there a weapon? Why wasn't there a plan? He didn't come into that room intending to kill. He came in to love his wife. But instead, he lost himself in a moment of rage. Both the prosecution and the defense brought in forensic psychologists to analyze Omari's actions. The prosecution's expert testified that jealousy-driven homicides often come from a place of control, not love. He argued that Omari's actions were not just emotional, but calculated. He waited, he let her suffer, and he only called 911 when he knew she was gone. The defense's psychologist countered, explaining that rage killings can happen in an instant, with no time for logical thought. The jury listened, their faces unreadable. Was this a man who simply lost control? Or was this a man who made sure his wife would never choose another man over him again? The courtroom fell into silence as the judge read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Omari Karis, guilty of second-degree murder." Gasps echoed through the room. Zafina's family clutched one another, tears streaming down their faces. Omari's mother sobbed, her hands pressed against her mouth in disbelief. The judge's voice was steady. "Omari Karisa, you have been convicted of second-degree murder. In light of the excessive force used, the delay in calling for help, and the nature of this crime, this court sentences you to 35 years in prison without the possibility of parole." Omari barely reacted. He sat still, staring straight ahead, as if his body was present, but his mind had already left the room. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, debating the verdict. Some believed justice had been served. He killed her in cold blood, He let her suffer. He deserves every year he got. Others felt the sentence was too harsh. He wasn't a killer. He was a man who lost control. This wasn't murder. It was heartbreak. Some pointed to the larger issue at play. Why do men feel entitled to a woman's love? If she didn't love him the way he wanted, why did that mean she had to die? Omari Kireze, a man who had once been a rising real estate mogul, a man who had stood at the altar with a woman he swore he would love forever, was now inmate. And Zafina Jurel, a woman who had dreamed of a life full of adventure, would never get to see another day. Love, rage, jealousy, it had all collided in that honeymoon suite. And in the end, only one person walked away. The trial was over. The verdict had been reached. But for the people who loved Zafina Jurel, the pain didn't end in the courtroom. It would follow them for the rest of their lives. Her mother, Naomi Laverne, spoke out in the days after the sentencing, her voice filled with sorrow and exhaustion. My daughter should still be here. She should be planning her future, not buried in the ground. She loved hard and she trusted the wrong person. And now she's gone. Naomi didn't just mourn the loss of her daughter. She mourned the grandchild she never got to meet. Zafina had been 3 months pregnant, something her family had only discovered after the autopsy. 2 lives stolen in a single moment of rage. Women need to pay attention to the signs, Naomi said. If a man keeps telling you he's insecure because of your past, believe him. Because insecurity turns into control, and control turns into violence. My daughter ignored the warnings. Please don't make the same mistake. Could this have been prevented? Were the warning signs always there? How many other women are in relationships just like this, unaware that the person who claims to love them is capable of something unthinkable? This wasn't just a crime. It was a reflection of a bigger problem. How love, when twisted by insecurity, can become something violent, something deadly. And the question remains, how many others are suffering in silence, unaware of the danger lurking in the ones they trust the most? What do you think? Was this crime an act of temporary insanity, or was it fueled by deep-seated resentment and control? Was Omari Kireze a man pushed past his breaking point, or was this murder inevitable from the very start? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this case compelling, make sure to subscribe for more true crime stories every week. Because in the world of crime and justice, the truth is always stranger than fiction.